So by way of background, the John Hunt Franklin Center for Reconciliation is engaged in a documentary studies project, and the idea behind the project is to gather and kind of assess historical memory surrounding the 1921 Tulsa race riot.
All right.
And by design, the idea conceptually was to look at five or so black families, five or so white families, and kind of examine what sorts of stories and narratives have been passed throughout the generations on the 1921 Tulsa race riot.
Sure.
So I just want to start out by having you tell me a little bit about yourself. Just some basic background information like your full name, date and place of birth, parents, siblings, ancestors, spouse, children, all that kind of, whatever background information you think helpful.
Sure. Well, my name is Bob Lafortune. My parents came to Tulsa in 1920 from South Bend, Indiana. That's where my dad was from, and my mother was from a neighboring city, Mishawaka, Indiana. I'm a sibling with two sisters and a brother, and they were all older than I was. I was born at St. John Hospital in 1927, and I've spent all of my life in Tulsa, with the exception of a couple of years away at college and in the service. So I grew up, went to Catholic schools, Marquette as grade school, and Cassia Hall for high school. I attended the University of Tulsa off and on for 2 years, in and out of the service, and graduated from Purdue University in Indiana in 1951. And since '51, I got married to a lovely lady, Jean Morse Lafortune, M-O-R-S-E. We had 6 children, a lot of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, 24 in total. And 5 of my children live here. 1 lives in Colorado. They all have families and grandchildren, so I'm fortunate to have a large family. I went into business after college graduation in the chemical business. Eventually went into the drilling business, or the rotary drilling business, in 1953 with a friend of mine. And I was in that business about 10 years. I'd worked 5 of those years with a chemical company as a salesman in about a 6-state area in the southwest part of the country. In 1964, I was encouraged to run for office in city government, and so I ran for the office of Commissioner of Streets and Public Property. At that time, the city had a commission form of government. They had 6 elected officials, 5 of whom represented the voting members of the commission, 4 commissioners and a mayor. And I served 3 terms as a Commissioner of Streets and Public Property. In 1970, I ran for mayor and won, and served 4 2-year terms as mayor, concluding in 1978. From there, I went on the board of the Williams Companies, and went on some civic boards, St. John Medical Center, now St. John Health System. I went on the Philbrook board, all of those after I got out of being mayor. And I served on the Williams board for about 21 years. Had to retire, got too old, according to their bylaws. And however, I was appointed then to a subsidiary board of the Williams Companies called APCO Oil and Gas International, APCO Argentina Oil and Gas. And I'm still on that board. I'm also in about 1995, I joined the Bank of Oklahoma Financial Corporation Board, and I still serve as a member of that. Been involved in a lot of civic boards, interests. Philbrook, St. John, the Performing Arts Center Trust, all of particular interest to me, those three. I've been active in the United Way. I was a campaign chair and a board chair, and I still continue an interest with the Metropolitan Human Services Commission, which is staffed by staff from the Community Service Council. So that has enabled me to keep an interest in some of the social justice side of the city. Of course, Philbrook has its own art museum and very busy with their activities. St. John Medical Center has been a prime interest of mine for since 1978. And that kind of capsulizes me up to date.
Great. Thank you so much. So let's take a few steps back. You grew up in an era of segregation. Are there any particular incidents or experiences around segregation, the legal separation of blacks and whites in the community, that stand out for you?
Well, I'm sure that I have a recollection of the discrimination that existed in Tulsa and probably throughout the many parts of the country as I was growing up, because I knew that there was a separation of seating or visitorship to restaurants, motels. I knew the railroad station, for instance, which I used the trains a lot as I was growing up. They had separate facilities for black and white. I knew that there were black and white drinking fountains. I played golf at Mohawk Golf Course. I remember the drinking fountains at Mohawk Golf Course that were segregated. So I have those memories, pretty much through high school and into my college years. And then I can recall even prior to my entering City Hall, the national things that were happening with regard to Martin Luther King and his emergence as a very prominent black leader and spokesman for black civil rights. I knew that in Tulsa we had segregated facilities like cafeterias, and even at the very start of my first service as a commissioner for the city in 1964, there was segregation of our eating establishments and probably of our hotels and motels. Those are very prominent recollections that I have. One of the first things that I encountered when I got into public office as a commissioner was the proposal for the city to enact a public accommodations ordinance that would have freed any public accommodation, restaurants, hotels, motels, any eating establishments and things like that, from segregation. And that was being proposed even though there was the prospect of a federal anti-discrimination or public accommodations statute at the federal level. To my knowledge, there was nothing at the state level enacted. At any rate, I hadn't been in office more than a few weeks before we were confronted with a public accommodations ordinance for the city of Tulsa. And it was a hot topic. We had groups who were adamantly opposed to it. We had white spokespeople who would drive their cars around downtown with signs on the top of their car protesting any kind of a public accommodations ordinance. We had protesters come to City Hall, mostly from the ministerial community, who were proponents of enacting this ordinance. And even that got a little controversial because even though the ordinance was pretty plain as far as the facilities that it spoke to, there were some proponents of an ordinance that thought it wasn't strong enough, that it should include more things about desegregation. At any rate, I was the first member of the elected body on the commission to publicly endorse the public accommodations ordinance that was proposed. Mayor Maxwell, a Democrat, was for it, and we had had a conversation about that, he and I personally. He knew what I was going to do. I knew that he was in favor of it, that I wouldn't be the only one. But of the two Republicans on the commission at the time, I was the only Republican that endorsed it. So the ordinance passed by a vote of 4-1, with the Commissioner of Water Works and Sewerage, Dean Langenheim, being the only no vote, and the other commissioners being in favor of it, along with Mayor Maxwell and myself.
Okay. Now, during that period, how would you characterize the relationships between ordinary black citizens of Tulsa and ordinary white citizens of Tulsa? Were they cordial, or what descriptors would you use for the relationships?
Well, I'd say they were cordial. I campaigned in the black community and actively visited many of the church ministers because I knew that they spoke well to their congregations for and against many of the candidates who were up. So I had made those personal visits and was always treated very politely and friendly. And I don't even recall any bad vibrations, so to speak, from any black individuals. I had one black person who was particularly involved in my campaign, Elmer Davis Sr. Elmer was a head of the music department at the Tulsa Public School System, and he was the choir director of the Chorus of Angels, which at that time was a very prominent choral group from his church, a black church. So I had good associations with many blacks at the time who helped me in my campaign actively. Prior to getting in politics, I would say that I had a very neutral attitude about blacks, and any recollection that they might have about the race riot never came up. We had black maids work for our household for many years, as I was from being a toddler up to when I would have been 30 years old or something. Race riot to me was never mentioned. It was never a topic of conversation. Like, did I remember it? Did I have it? No. I obviously wouldn't have a recollection of it, but what would I know about it? And about the only story that I have that pertains to the race riot itself was from my dad and my mother. They had moved to Tulsa in 1920 from Indiana, and they were both very Catholic. I think the Catholics knew, or even in Indiana, were very well aware of the Ku Klux Klan. A very high percentage of Indiana residents were members associated with the Ku Klux Klan. There had been riots at Notre Dame University with the Ku Klux Klan and students at the school. So there was some history that my parents would have had with regard to black-white relationships even before they came to Oklahoma. At any rate, they moved to Tulsa in 1920, and they had been married just shortly before that in Mishawaka, and they rented an apartment in the what they call the library apartments. In those days, the Carnegie Library was located at the 3rd and Cheyenne, as I recall. And the library apartments were right next door to the Carnegie Library for the city of Tulsa. And so they had an apartment there, and my dad did tell me that on the day of the riot, he went up on the roof of the apartment and could see the smoke and the fire coming up from North Tulsa. And that was his only recollection of the riot. He did not get involved in any of the street activities that apparently took place along with that.
Did you as a child ever have occasion to visit what some of the media call the Negro Quarter or the Greenwood District or the African American community in Tulsa for any reason?
I think that I would have been probably just going to and from the homes where our maids lived.
Okay.
I would have certainly been through the Greenwood area. And I was familiar enough with the street itself that I knew pretty much what the general topography was and the general setup for the buildings and the businesses that were in place when I was growing up. I don't recall seeing the areas of devastation that maybe hadn't been rebuilt even when I would have been a youngster.
Okay, okay. And when was it that you recall having heard the first narrative about the riot, about the fact that there was a riot and some of the particular facts surrounding the riot? At what point in your childhood or your adulthood were you exposed to that?
I don't know that I could recall a specific time when that would have happened.
Do you recall where you might have gotten information at some point about the riot?
Well, I think it would have come from my parents.
From your parents?
Because of their own experience having been here at that time. So they knew there was a huge disturbance going on, and they knew there was devastation occurring in North Tulsa. They just weren't a part of the action, so to speak.
Right.
And my dad at that time, his office was downtown, in downtown Tulsa. But as far as I know at that time, in the National Bank of Tulsa building. So, but now we're talking about the 30s, 1930s,
Right.
not the 20s.
Right, right. What about exposure to the history surrounding the riot in the curriculum, either at Marquette or at Cascia, where you went to high school? Was there? Do you recall any discussion at school around these events?
I do not recall any description being given to us as students of the schools. I don't think that was talked about.
Okay, and then subsequently, were there newspaper articles or magazine articles or books at any point in your life that really gave you a fuller picture of what may have happened during the riot?
I don't recall any particular articles that came out, like on the anniversary date of the riot itself. You would have expected perhaps some articles in the both of our main papers, the Tribune and the World at that time. And if there were, I didn't see them.
What, as you understand it, was the role of the city of Tulsa in the riot itself?
Well, I read some history about the action and the inaction of with respect to the riot. And I know that the mayor was brought up on some impeachment charges, I think, as a result of dereliction of duty. But I don't know of any specific histories that were promulgated about the participation of the city. I know that when I would inquire about what kind of newspaper articles were available, that there weren't many. That the galley proofs of the newspaper articles had somehow been scavenged or cleaned up, so that the riot articles were not available. They simply weren't available. So, to my knowledge, most of the information that went into public print about the riot came from private sources, and just a handful of news articles that would have survived.
Okay. And would it be fair to say that most of what you know about the riot comes from exposure as an adult to history and books and such, that your formation of the narrative about the riot comes from the sources that you were exposed to as an adult, rather than you were exposed to directly as a child?
I think any detail about the riot, that would be true. I mean, I always knew from my parents their presence in Tulsa at the time of the riot. I always knew that, and that was talked about occasionally in our home. But as far as any detail about fatalities, the extent of the destruction, what caused the riot, or what was attributed as a cause of the riot, those things, when I would ask about them, finally came out in some of the printed materials that were written as history. But otherwise, the details on the origin of the riot itself and the things that took place, everything was very sketchy that I knew about.
Okay. Just reflecting back, what impact economically do you think the riot had on Tulsa?
Well, I know that it destroyed all the black businesses along Greenwood Avenue, and it probably set race relations back a good deal. It had to. But the economic impact was probably felt in the black community more than it was in the white community. I've never seen any numbers or figures, though, about whether Tulsa's economic climate had some depression following the riot, or whether it improved following the riot. I've never seen any of that. I knew that there was a lot of political turmoil and finger pointing for blame at why the whole situation wasn't contained by law enforcement more effectively at the time it started. That was always a sense of understanding that I had, that the riot, that the public officials and the civil police and policemen and even the whatever other military units might have been called, that they kind of let the riot happen, that it was not, there was no effort, no significant effort to contain it or to stop it.
Could such an event ever happen in Tulsa again?
No. No, it could not happen again, because I think our the control of our just the sense of our own police authorities and the fact that the state of Oklahoma would respond to something that wasn't being properly controlled or contained by local authorities. You just have you have even federal authorities that would bring in certain things at play that weren't called upon in this particular case in 1921.
Okay. You cited the Public Accommodations Ordinance that was passed in 1964 when you were on the commission as some evidence of progress in terms of race relations in Tulsa.
Right.
Where are we now? I mean, to what extent have we made progress, and what are examples of the progress that we've made?
Well, the other thing I did when I was a mayor was to work for open housing. And we did enact an open housing ordinance while I was mayor. It wasn't done until the early 70s. That gave non-discrimination penalties to people that didn't adhere to that.